Phil Black is out front in Kyiv tonight. And Phil, what is the latest on the ground there?
Erin, Ukrainian officials continue to report a really notable escalation in Russia's efforts across the south and the east, both in their bombardment of Ukrainian positions, but also their efforts to drive forward and take territory. Ukraine insists, though, that it is still repelling those attacks. Ukraine says that it is continuing to inflict heavy losses on Russian forces, both through killing soldiers but also capturing them as well. And Russian soldiers are accused of trying to compensate for the large number of its troops now in Ukrainian custody by targeting, going after Ukrainian citizens. Take a look. War creates powerful connections between people. Volodymyr Hropun and Nadia Yarova didn't know each other before the Russians came. Now he's brought her news that inspires pain and hope. Volodymyr was recently freed from a military detention center in Russia. He says Nadia's grandson, Sasha, was there too. For weeks, Sasha's family didn't know if he was still alive. Seized and held by Russian soldiers in early March, they heard nothing about his safety after the invaders retreated. Vasily and Halina Hilyuk know the same pain and uncertainty. Volodymyr has told them he knows their son Dmytro was recently alive in the same detention center in Russia. He says he heard Dmytro's name shouted every day during roll call. There is comfort in that, but not enough to soothe a mother's anguish. I don't have hope anymore, Halina says. I know they are beasts. They will kill them and no one will find them. Ukrainian officials say dozens of people were abducted from around the town of Dima, near Kyiv, during Russia's occupation, and most were initially held here, in a sprawling industrial site the Russian forces used as a command post. This is where they were kept?
Yeah.
Ukrainian prosecutor Alexander Zuz shows me the conditions those captured people were forced to endure. A small, dark, cold room. People were packed together here, he says, hands bound, eyes taped.
In this place were 22 people. When they're trying to get to the toilet, they need to walk on legs of somebody else, because there are too much people.
He says people came and went. Some spent weeks here. Someone tried to keep track of days by scratching marks on the wall. He says all the people who came through this room had only one thing in common. They were civilians. Several people who were kept here tell us they were frequently beaten and interrogated for local information. One man says his hands and fingers were cut to the bone by Russian soldiers because he couldn't help them. Does it make any sense to you that they did this?
No sense. I don't know exactly what kind of information they could take from these people.
This drone video captures the moment when Ukrainian forces attacked the industrial site, driving out the Russians. A number of those who were still locked in the room at that time tell us that's when all remaining captives were able to escape. But others, including Volodymyr Hropun, had already been taken elsewhere. A long road trip via Belarus in the back of a military truck ended in Russia, where he was given this military identification document. It says he resisted the special operation conducted by the president of the Russian Federation. In reality, he was detained while volunteering with the Red Cross, helping people escape the fighting. The Ukrainian government has confirmed Volodymyr was returned to Ukraine as part of a prisoner exchange with Russia. He believes that explains why Russian forces are abducting Ukrainian civilians. He says they took us as goods that can be exchanged later, like a mobile phone or another commodity. Here, Volodymyr inspects a list of more than 40 names provided by the local government, a register of people from the area who are still missing. He says he recognizes most of the names from his time in the Russian detention center because he deliberately tried to remember as much as possible. He says sooner or later one of us had to be the first to be released, and that's why we tried to remember the names of other people, to let their relatives know they're alive. Erin, the Ukrainian government says there is around 1,000 civilians that are locked up in detention centers in Russia. In its words, it says they have effectively been taken hostage. Those who have lived through that experience say Russia's motivations are pretty clear. They believe that they were abducted specifically to play the role of a currency, to beef up Russia's negotiating power in its efforts to try and secure the release of its own captured soldiers. Erin.
Thank you so much for that powerful report, Phil Black from Kyiv. And I want to go now to retired Army Major General Paul Eaton, the former commanding general of coalition military assistance training in Iraq, and Steve Hall, former CIA chief of Russia operations. So, Steve, let's talk about why you hear Phil saying it's sort of a currency, for lack of a better word, that Putin is doing this to be able to get some of his own POWs back. These, of course, though, are civilians, Ukrainian civilians. Why is he abducting civilians in this way?
Yeah, first of all, you have to dwell for a moment, Erin, on the point that you just made. These are not military people. This is not a POW type of situation where somebody's captured in a combat situation and then held. And there's pretty strict guidelines with regard to POW treatment. But these are just civilians. And I think the Russians are using these folks for a number of different reasons. One, of course, is what was mentioned in the report, which is they are sort of hostages in the sense that, not unlike what North Korea oftentimes does, they capture people. Of course, the Russians do this too. There's a number of Americans that are still in jail in Moscow, but they capture people so they can exchange them later. There's sometimes of intelligence value to get information on the local happenings. They can be returned as assets, so the Russians can try to blackmail them and to continue to cooperate with them once they've been returned to Ukraine. All of this is not acceptable behavior for an army in the field, and it's pretty amazing that I suppose it's not amazing. It's something that they do often, but it's obviously not something that's normal in the rules of law, rules of warfare.
Right. No, of course not. And General Eaton, when it comes to what the United States can be doing right now, obviously there's a lot more military assistance going in, but you think that there is something glaring, I understand, that the U.S. should be doing right now that it is not. What is that?
Erin, we need to transmit to the Russian army, to the Russian chain of command, that the Black Sea is not their lake. They've got a lot of naval assets. We need to move NATO naval assets under an integrated command to put them into the Black Sea, put them in visual and radar distance from the Russian fleet. We don't need to try to escalate this thing. We just need to establish a presence, make President Putin understand that the Dead Sea is not his for freedom of navigation, is not his for freedom of action, and to leave doubt in his mind that if cruise missiles start leaving the rails of his ships, that there is a possibility that there will be a response.
So, Steve, this comes as the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said, in his words, it is hard to know if Russian forces were targeting himself and Secretary of State Antony Blinken over the weekend when they struck rail lines. And they did it just a few hours after the two left Kyiv by rail. Do you think it's possible, Steve, that Russia did that on purpose?
Well, I certainly think it's not just possible, but in my view, highly likely that the Russians are targeting rail lines and railway stations, primarily because it's clear that the Russians are completely flummoxed at at the amount of weaponry and reinforcement and ammunitions that are coming in to Ukraine to support the Ukrainian army in their fight against the Russians. So it's no surprise, really, that the Russians want to try to cut off those lines inside of Ukraine so it makes it harder for the Ukrainians to get that ammunition and those weapons provided by the West to the front lines. With regard to, senior American leadership or, Western leadership, I think if they manage to hit and kill, some senior leaders in the West, I think that would just be the cherry on top for Putin and for Russians. They would say, well, look, they were in a war zone and, you guys are the ones who are responsible for helping the Ukrainians fight this war, which you shouldn't be doing. So you're going to lose people too. As to whether or not they were actually targeting senior leadership in the United States, I'm not sure about that, but they certainly wouldn't be averse to having it happen.
So, General Eaton, the U.S. is saying that the drone action on the Belarusian-Polish border is a clear threat as well. When you look at that, you look at Moldova, do you think the conflict right now, where it is at great risk of a sort of meteoric expansion, or do you think that risk has diminished?
Erin, I believe the risk is increasing radically, that what we're seeing in Moldova, Transnistria is this opportunity, false flag, pretext establishment to bring military action into that region. The forces that may be brought to bear would have to come through some of the most important economic terrain that Ukraine has.
Yeah.
That Odessa is the jewel in the crown here. No, it's very much a escalating risk right now at the hands of Mr. Putin.
Thank you both very much for this conversation.